Then Ever since they won control of the government in 2016, Republicans have been obsessed with getting this one thing done.
Tax reform.
Tax reform.
Tax reform.
Tax reform.
We're going to have a phenomenal tax reform.
They've passed a bill, the president has signed it, so let's break down what's actually going to change. If you break the population into 5 equally sized groups based on how much they earned in 2017, and look at how much each group will earn in 2018, every group does get a tax cut. But fast forward 10 years, and you can see that lower and middle class Americans will actually pay more since their tax cuts aren't permanent. And if you break that top group into smaller groups, you can see the very wealthiest benefit most of all. So while this new law does close some loopholes to bring in new tax revenue, the bill's larger purpose is to realize the Republican vision of a fairer tax code, one in which the wealthiest pay a lot less.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution, and 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are. Teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976 they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money. But do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
These 10 people represent everyone in America. This person on the left, she represents the poorest 10% of Americans. And on the right, he is the very richest 10%. So let's ask this group a simple question. What percentage of your income gets taxed? Most Americans pay multiple income taxes to the federal government and state governments and local governments. But a recent analysis by 2 economists added up all the income taxes. And when you do that, the data shows that poor people pay a very small part of their income to the government, and rich people pay more. This concept of taxing the poor at a lower rate and taxing the rich more, this is called progressive taxation. It's how taxes work in most countries. But it's also why some critics question whether these people are getting away without paying their fair share.
The middle class and the poor that pay, if anything, a lot less.
Why is it that 45% of the population of this country is not contributing back to the rest?
But now let's add one more guy to this group of 10. This guy? He represents the 400 richest Americans, billionaires. Billionaires don't make most of their money through typical income, so their income actually gets taxed at lower rates than these less rich people. Now you might be thinking, don't billionaires pay taxes in other ways? And the answer is yes. This is just the income tax, and there are lots of other kinds of taxes in America. And this analysis, where this data came from, it looked at all those taxes. And it shows that when we add them all up, there actually is someone in this group who might not be paying their fair share. Let's go back to our first chart with these 11 people. Remember, this is just the income tax. What happens when we add in all the other taxes? Well, let's look at another kind of tax, corporate and property taxes. These are the taxes we pay on things we own, usually businesses and property, and the money we make on them. Usually rich people own more things, so these corporate and property taxes hit them the hardest. Rich people also tend to be from rich families. And when they inherit a lot of money, the government taxes them. This is called an estate tax. Put these taxes together and it's clear that they place a much heavier burden on the rich, including billionaires. Add these back onto the income taxes, and it looks like the rich really do pay way more than the poor. But now let's talk about another tax. This one's buried in your pay stub. Look closely and you'll see something called a Medicare tax and a Social Security tax. Sometimes pay stubs call them FICA. Anyway, combined, these are called payroll taxes. Medicare and Social Security are 2 really important programs. They provide healthcare and a modest income for when we get old and retire. But they're also expensive, which is why we have these payroll taxes separate from the income tax to pay for them. So on your paycheck, you'll notice that you're taxed 7.65% in payroll taxes, and your company is supposed to pay another 7.65% on your behalf. But economists have found that in practice, the way companies pay their part of the payroll tax is by just paying workers less. So in reality, many workers pay nearly the full 15.3% toward this tax. And everyone is on the hook for the same percentage. But the wealthy? Once someone earns more than about $130,000 a year, the money they make beyond that isn't subject to the Social Security tax. It's capped. That means the rich pay a really small portion of their income toward payroll taxes, and poor people in the middle class pay way more. Add payroll taxes onto this chart, and it starts to flatten out. The last type of taxes we're going to look at are the taxes we pay when we buy stuff. For example, let's say you're looking to buy a t-shirt. When you check out, you pay a sales tax, which is a percentage of its cost. And sales taxes apply to most things: furniture, toilet paper, laundry detergent. For some items like beer and gasoline, there are additional taxes that get incorporated into the price tag before you even get to the store. These are called consumption taxes, and we all pay the same rate on the things we buy, regardless of how rich we are. Now, you might think that since rich people usually buy more things and more expensive things, they pay a larger percentage of their income toward these taxes. But relative to how much money they have, the stuff they buy and the taxes they pay on that stuff take up a relatively small portion of their income. Meanwhile, everyone, even people with almost no money, needs to buy certain basic things to survive. And for poor people, those basic things and the taxes that come with them cost them almost everything they earn. So if we chart how much of their income each of these people pays in consumption taxes, we can see that poor people pay a much larger portion. When we put these taxes together, suddenly we see a big change. The chart shows us that this line from before is a lie. That America's tax system as a whole isn't very progressive. Instead, it's mostly flat. Poor people pay about the same portion of their income in taxes as rich people. And this guy, this billionaire, is paying a smaller portion than everyone else, even the poorest. If you just look at certain types of taxes, it's natural to assume that rich people pay a bigger tax burden in the US, and that poor people aren't exactly paying their fair share. But a more complete look at the bigger picture challenges that. And it suggests that if we're looking for a group that isn't paying their fair share, we might be looking on the wrong end.
Income inequality has always existed in the US, but the gap between rich and poor hasn't always been as wide as it is today. Let's take a look at how economic and political forces have changed the share of income held by the whole bottom 50% and just the top 1% of earners. The mid-century was a period of economic stability. The richest 1% earned 13% of all US income, while the bottom half earned 20% of income. In the 1960s, Americans were still riding a post-war job boom. In the 70s, the lowest-paid Americans got a boost from a steadily increasing minimum wage. Sky-high salaries weren't as typical as they are today. The 80s changed everything. Minimum wage stagnated. Factory jobs were automated or outsourced. Ronald Reagan passed huge tax cuts for the richest, and executive pay soared. By the mid-90s, the earnings of the top 1% surpassed everyone in the bottom half altogether. The rich were on a tear, and even financial crashes in the 2000s didn't slow them down. Today, the share of income claimed by those at the very top and those in the bottom half are completely reversed from what they were in the 60s. Other countries don't have such a wide gap between rich and poor. Among economically developed nations, the US is one of the most unequal, according to the Gini Index, which rates places based on how wealth is distributed. The higher the number, the more unequal the country is. The top 1% in the US is primarily made up of men. Women-dominated fields like teaching and waitressing are lower paying. Women are promoted less often than men. They make 82 cents for every dollar that men make. The top tier is also very white. Minority groups face systemic racism that has contributed to gaps in education, housing, and employment opportunities. African Americans make only 78 cents for every dollar white people make. Inequality varies across the U.S. because of regional economics. Large urban areas like New York City are more unequal because they have low-income residents as well as those in tech, finance, and other industries that offer sky-high wages. Whereas the Great Lakes region is more equal because the wage gap there isn't as wide. Race plays a role too. Southern states, which are generally more racially diverse, tend to be more unequal, while pockets of the West that are more white tend to be more equal. Upward social mobility is especially challenging for those at the very bottom. The rich tend to stay rich, and the poor tend to stay poor. So what could be done? Some legislators have proposed putting the brakes on runaway wealth by raising income taxes on top earners. Many states recently increased the minimum wage, and some states are closing education gaps by expanding access to early learning programs. But on a federal level, there's no consensus, and ultimately, closing the gap between rich and poor will require agreement from an increasingly partisan government, as well as societal shifts to combat sexism and racism. Change isn't around the corner, but understanding how we got here in the first place is a good first step.
Some politicians are calling for higher taxes on the rich. And naturally, these proposals have unleashed a torrent of opposition, mostly from the rich. Myth. A top marginal tax rate applies to all of a person's total income or wealth.
Why aren't you giving 70% of your income to the government? You could.
You're going to tax 70% of your paycheck.
Wrong. It would only apply to dollars in excess of a certain level. The 70% income tax rate proposed by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would apply only to dollars in excess of $10 million a year. The 2% wealth tax proposed by Elizabeth Warren would apply only to wealth in excess of $50 million. Myth. Raising taxes on the rich is a far-left idea.
She wants to radically tax the rich.
Taxing rich people, that's an old saw from the left.
Baloney. 70% of Americans, including 54% of Republicans, support raising taxes on families making more than $10 million a year. And expecting the rich to pay their fair share is a traditional American idea. From 1930 to 1980, the average top marginal income tax rate was 78%. From 1951 to 1963, it exceeded 90%. Again, only on dollars in excess of a very high threshold. Even considering all deductions and tax credits, the very rich paid over half of their top incomes in taxes. Myth. A wealth tax is unconstitutional.
Bad idea.
And it's likely unconstitutional.
Sounds great, not constitutional, I don't think.
Rubbish. Most locales already impose an annual wealth tax on the value of people's homes, the main source of household wealth for most people. It's called the property tax. The rich hold most of their wealth in stocks and bonds. So why should these forms of wealth escape taxation? Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to lay and collect taxes. Myth. When taxes on the rich are cut, they invest more and everyone benefits. When taxes on the rich are increased, economic growth slows.
The frightening thing about high marginal tax rates is that it leads us into a low productivity economy.
They're going to stop creating jobs. If you raise the interest rates, they'll stop investing money. They'll stop borrowing money. And that has a trickle-down effect.
Utter baloney. Trickle-down economics is a cruel joke. Donald Trump, George W. Bush, and Ronald Reagan all cut taxes on the rich, and nothing trickled down. There's no evidence that higher taxes on the rich slows economic growth. To the contrary, when the top marginal tax rate has been high, between 71 and 92%, growth has averaged 4% a year. But when the top rate has been low, between 28 and 39%, growth has averaged only 2.1%. Myth. When you cut taxes on corporations, they invest more and create more jobs.
Will stimulate investment domestically.
Stimulate the jobs that the economy needs.
Wrong again. After Trump and the Republicans lowered the corporate tax rate in 2018, America's largest corporations cut more jobs than they created. They used their tax savings largely to increase their stock prices by buying back their own shares of stock, enriching executives and wealthy investors, but providing no real benefit to the economy. Myth. The rich already pay more than their fair share in taxes.
When she says the thing about fair share, you know, the top 1% of earners pay 40% of income taxes.
The top 1% already pay 37% of all federal income taxes.
This is misleading because it focuses only on income taxes, leaving out the large and growing tax burden on lower income Americans. Payroll taxes, state and local sales taxes, and property taxes take bigger bites out of the pay of lower income families than higher income. Myth. The rich already pay capital gains taxes.
The very, very top pay capital gains tax.
We already have a 30%, 20 to 30% tax on capital gains.
Misleading. Rich families avoid paying capital gains taxes by passing their wealth on to their heirs. In fact, the largest share of big estates transferred from generation to generation are unrealized capital gains that have never been taxed. Myth. The estate tax is a death tax that hits millions of Americans.
Does death trigger another grab from the government? It's so un-American, it just turns my stomach.
She wants another bite at the apple. And when you die, even another bite at the apple, 40% worth.
Baloney. The current estate tax, which only applies to assets in excess of $11 million or $22 million for couples, affects fewer than 2,000 families. Myth. If taxes are raised on the wealthy, they will find ways to evade them, so very little money is going to be raised.
Billionaires will go somewhere else, multimillionaires will go somewhere else.
So you raise these taxes and people shift their investments to avoid higher taxes.
More rubbish. For example, a 2% wealth tax, as proposed by Senator Elizabeth Warren, would raise around $2.75 trillion over the next decade, with very little tax evasion, according to research. A 70% tax on incomes over $10 million would raise close to $720 billion over the next 10 years. Myth. The only reason to raise taxes on the wealthy is to collect revenue.
No one really believes that it would either bring in more revenues.
It's not just because you object to the existence of rich people. You're not trying to hurt them. You just want to pay for more stuff.
No. Although these proposals would generate lots of revenue and help us reduce the national debts while investing in schools, roads, and all the other things we need, another major purpose is to reduce inequality and thereby safeguard democracy against oligarchy. Myth. It's unfair to raise taxes on the wealthy.
Seems to me like it's more a debate about punishing the rich, about punishing success.
The most successful are not only paying their fair share, they're paying the most. Pay your fair share? What are you talking about?
Actually, it's unfair not to raise taxes on the rich. For the last 40 years, most Americans have seen almost no growth in their incomes at all, while the incomes of a minority at the top have skyrocketed. We're rapidly heading toward a society dominated by a handful of super rich, many of whom have never worked a day in their lives. More than 60% of wealth in America is now inherited. Myth. They earned it. It's their money.
I think if people earn money, they should be able to hold on to it.
And be able to do as they see fit with their newfound hard-earned cash.
Hogwash. It's their country, too. They couldn't maintain their fortunes without what America provides: national defense, police, laws, courts, political stability, and the Constitution. They couldn't have got where they are without other things America provides: education, infrastructure, and a nation that respects private property. And to argue it's their money also ignores a lot of other ways America has bestowed advantages on the rich. Everything from bailing out Wall Street bankers when they get into trouble to subsidizing the research of big pharma. So the next time you hear one of these myths, know the truth.
Shelby County, Alabama, April 2010. The county sues the United States Attorney General, who at the time was Eric Holder. Why? Well, Shelby County said that parts of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were unconstitutional. You know, the law that Martin Luther King Jr. and many others fought so hard to get passed to end voter discrimination that often targeted African Americans in the South. Shelby County had an issue with Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which required certain state and local governments to get clearance with the Attorney General if they wanted to change their election laws. Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act described a formula used to determine which governments would be subject to that pre-clearance requirement in Section 5. Shelby County was basically like, we ain't discriminating anymore, so why discriminate against us? It argued Sections 5 and 4B of the Voting Rights Act were unconstitutional and that the times had changed, so they were outdated anyway. Well, the judge, John D. Bates, sided with the Attorney General, saying that such requirements were still needed to fight discrimination. Oh, you know that Shelby County went all up and appealed, but on May 18th, 2012, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit agreed with the lower court. So Shelby County appealed again, this time to the Supreme Court, who agreed to hear oral arguments on February 27th, 2013. The court had a lot to consider for this case. Obviously, the Voting Rights Act, but also the 14th Amendment, which protects everyone's right to due process under the law, the 15th Amendment, which protects everyone from having their right to vote taken away based on, quote, race, color, or previous condition of servitude, and finally, the 10th Amendment, which reserves all rights not granted to the federal government to the states. Whew. The big question, did state and local governments still have to follow Sections 5 and 4B of the Voter Rights Act? The court said no, but boy, this was a close one. On June 25th, 2013, they announced they had sided with Shelby County by a vote of 5-4. The court argued that Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional because the coverage formula was based on information that was more than 40 years old. The court did not strike down Section 5, but without Section 4B, no jurisdiction could be subject to a pre-clearance unless Congress established a new coverage formula. To this day, Congress has not done that, by the way. The court added that Congress can't subject a state to pre-clearance simply based on past discrimination. Writing for the majority, Chief Justice John Roberts argued that federal protection was no longer needed. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote a dissenting opinion acknowledging that yes, voting discrimination had indeed decreased since the Voting Rights Act passed, but that was mostly due to the Voting Rights Act. Quote, throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. Ginsburg added that the 14th, 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments all provided evidence that indeed Congress could get all up in the business of state and local governments in order to protect the vote. Today, Shelby County v. Holder remains a controversial decision. Critics have argued that the ruling has made it easier for state officials to make it more difficult for people of color to vote. One thing that is indisputable, since the ruling, several states that used to have to get pre-clearance under the Voting Rights Act have passed laws that have made it more difficult to vote, getting rid of things like early voting and same-day voter registration. 5 years after the ruling, around 1,000 polling places have been closed in the country. Most of these closed polling places were in counties with African American majority populations. One study also found that jurisdictions that used to have to get pre-clearance under the Voting Rights Act have dramatically kicked more folks off voter registration lists. And many of those taken off voter registration lists don't even know they've been kicked off.
In 2018, Americans voted for who would represent them in Congress. But in North Carolina, the election results were really weird. These squares represent all the voters in North Carolina. They were voting for these 13 seats in Congress. About half voted for Republicans, and about 48% voted for Democrats. So you might think of the 13 congressional seats, maybe Democrats would have won 6 seats, and Republicans would have won 7. But no. Democrats only won 3 of 13 seats, way less than half. This imbalance was because North Carolina's congressional districts had been gerrymandered. It means that these voters had been grouped into districts very strategically with the goal of benefiting one party. Gerrymandering has pretty much always happened in America. That's because every 10 years, the political districts are redrawn. And in most cases, those new lines get drawn by whoever holds power in state government at the time. That's what happened in 2010. Republicans won control of lots of state governments and redrew the political lines to favor themselves. And over the next few years, redistricting helped them hold on to almost all those states. This shifted the balance of power. And it turns out behind a lot of this was one guy.
Usually the voters get to pick the politicians. In redistricting, the politicians get to pick the voters.
This is Thomas Hofeller, the mapmaker who helped Republicans gerrymander districts over the last decade. When Hofeller died in 2018, his daughter found thousands of his emails and files, which she shared with activists. The files show that Tom Hofeller's fingerprints are all over the way America's political maps look today. But North Carolina was his masterpiece. And if you want to understand why gerrymandering is such a big problem in the US, that's a good place to start. The basics of gerrymandering are actually pretty simple. If you're a Republican trying to keep power, you want to do two things. First, pack as many Democratic voters as possible into a single district. If you have a district where almost everyone votes Democrat, that means almost half these votes are basically wasted. You can also crack big Democratic areas into separate districts where there are slightly more Republicans. So even though an area has a lot of Democratic votes, they would actually lose in this district and in this district. These are the two elements of classic gerrymandering, packing and cracking. And Hofeller employed these techniques masterfully in North Carolina. In 2011, he was hired to redraw the state's political lines. And for congressional districts, he came up with this map. Now I just want to focus in on District 12, this weird skinny shape. In order to make sense of this shape, we have to look at another map. This map shows the percentage of black people in each neighborhood. The bluer areas are where more black people live. Hofeller basically gathered up black people in Winston-Salem, Greensboro, and Charlotte and packed them into one district. So that's how District 12 happened. Hofeller also did this with North Carolina state representatives and state senators. For example, here are the state senate districts. Here, he packed Winston-Salem into one district, and then packed Greensboro into its own district. These new districts helped Republicans get a stranglehold on power in the North Carolina State House. And over the next few years, they were able to pass crucial legislation.
A strict new voter ID law in North Carolina.
Which bathrooms transgender individuals can use in North Carolina?
In 2016 and 2017, federal courts ruled that both of these maps were unconstitutional. They said what North Carolina Republicans did wasn't just gerrymandering, it was racial gerrymandering, done to deliberately dilute the political power of black people. The court said the Republicans in the North Carolina State House now had to redraw the lines without looking at racial demographics. So, they went back to Tom Hofeller. This time, Hofeller couldn't look at race. Instead, he looked at which areas voted for Democrats and which areas voted for Republicans. Instead of a racial gerrymander, it would be a partisan gerrymander. Here's that map, using data from 2014. The bluer an area, the more Democratic voters there are. Now, if you zoom in here to Greensboro, you can see one of the highest concentrations of Democratic voters in the state. Hofeller drew a congressional district line to crack this community in half. This meant Democrats here were now in the minority in their district, and Democrats here were also in the minority in their district. Hofeller employed these techniques all over the state to create North Carolina's new political districts. And the first big test for these new maps would be the 2018 election. Democrats were expected to turn out in droves.
Democrats are vying for a potential blue wave.
The wave that Republicans fear is going to wipe them out.
So, how did the maps do? For state representatives, Democrats got 51% of the vote. They only won 46% of seats. For state senate, they received half the vote and won just 42% of seats. And for Congress, you already know how that one turned out. Democrats won nearly half the votes, but won only 3 out of 13 seats. A year later in 2019, the Supreme Court weighed in. They said it was beyond their reach, that it wasn't their job to fix it. All of this raised an existential question. If Republicans could continue drawing the lines to stay in power, how could they ever be elected out of office? But the Supreme Court's ruling left open the possibility for state courts to rule on partisan gerrymandering. And in September 2019, that's exactly what North Carolina's Supreme Court did. The court found that partisan gerrymandering violated the state constitution. In the court's decision, it was Hofeler's files that helped prove that North Carolina Republicans drew these lines with a clear intention of benefiting themselves. Ultimately, the court said North Carolina Republicans had to redraw the state House and state Senate maps one more time. This new map, approved by North Carolina legislators, is much less biased toward one party, even though it took some extreme measures and nearly a decade to force politicians to draw a fair map. In the last few years, the courts in several states, like Florida and Pennsylvania, have made partisan gerrymandering much harder. And now that's also the case in North Carolina. Hofeler is gone now. But in other states across the country, many maps he helped draw are still in use. And while there's now a clearer strategy to challenge those maps in state courts, many voters are still effectively not choosing their representatives. It's like Hofeler said, the representatives are choosing the voters.
Of course, redistricting is democracy at work. Redistricting is like an election in reverse. It's a great event.
Voter turnout during the 2020 presidential election in the state of Georgia shattered records. Millions voted early or mailed in ballots. Now the state is ground zero for an avalanche of bills that could sharply restrict voter access. The bills proposed by state Republicans would curtail mail-in voting, impose strict identification rules, and limit the use of ballot drop boxes. Similar legislation is being pushed in over 40 states. Civil rights groups and Democrats say it's a deliberate attempt to suppress black and brown voters.
I will be damned if I let the fight of my forefathers, my ancestors looking at me, and I roll over and lay down and allow them to do this. So we will fight in here. You fight out here, and we will win.
We will stop the steal.
Republicans say the new laws aim to restore faith in the electoral process. For months, former President Trump and his allies made baseless claims the election was stolen. To mark the recent 65th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, a turning point in the civil rights movement, President Biden signed an executive order aimed at expanding voting rights. The House of Representatives also passed similar legislation, but the so-called For the People Act is likely to face a tough battle in the Senate.
The blood of John Lewis and so many other brave and righteous souls that was spilled in Selma on this Sunday in 1965 sanctified a noble struggle. And when the country saw those images that night, America was forced to confront the denial of democracy, the fierce urgency of justice.
Other Republican-backed bills in Georgia would restrict early voting, including on Sundays, traditional Souls to the Polls Day for African Americans.
We're still going to vote in record numbers. We're going to turn out. We're going to organize our people. But what we are saying right now is that these voter suppression bills, it's bad for democracy, and we shouldn't even have to be here fighting this same battle all over again.
For both the Democrats and the Republicans, this is now a fight for the soul of democracy. Many on the right believe the 2020 election was stolen despite evidence to the contrary. Those on the left want to expand and enshrine the right to vote. If these measures are passed, they will potentially put hurdles in place for tens of millions of voters. Andy Gallagher, Al Jazeera, Miami, Florida.